I started the engine at 5:17 a.m. The sky over Denver was still cloaked in navy silence, the kind of quiet that makes you second-guess everything, especially a 900-mile drive you weren't asked to make. But I made it anyway, because sometimes obligation masquerades as love, and I'd worn that disguise so long it had started to feel like skin. The heater groaned to life as I shifted into drive, my fingers wrapped tightly around the wheel like I was trying to stop something from slipping. Myself, maybe. In the passenger seat sat a gift box wrapped in soft gray paper with a yellow satin bow. Inside it were things I knew Marley would never ask for: organic cotton onesies, a handmade rattle carved from walnut, and a small engineering book I'd annotated in the margins. She used to love those marginal notes when she was younger, back when I was still someone who mattered. Beside the box, secured with 2 seatbelts, rested the cradle. Not a store-bought crib or some IKEA contraption. No, this was hand-carved, sanded down in my garage over months. Oak beams, smooth corners, stars engraved on the headboard. Each one a little imperfect because I wanted it to feel real, like the love behind it. I'd even stitched a nameplate on the lining, embroidered in navy thread, made by Grandpa. But of course, no one had called me that yet. Not officially. It was Cassandra's voice in my head that I couldn't shake, even over the hum of the tires on the highway. "Don't just show up, Graham," she had told me on the phone in October. "We've got it covered. Marley doesn't want stress right now." That word, stress, had become a euphemism for me. I was stress, a structural engineer with 30 years in the field, capable of calculating the tensile limits of suspension bridges, but apparently too emotionally unstable to attend my own daughter's baby shower. I didn't argue. I rarely did. I just transferred more money the following week. For $1,000, labeled nursery support. There had been many transfers before that. Tuition, housing, maternity essentials. When the emails came with requests, they were never from Marley directly. It was always Cassandra forwarding receipts or asking, "Can you help one last time?" And each time, I'd wire the funds and think, maybe this time I'll be included. Maybe this time I'll be remembered as more than a name on a transfer slip. The dashboard clock blinked 10:44 when I hit the Nebraska border. I stopped at a diner near the gas station just off Route 80. The waitress's name was Tilda. She had a pin that said, "Ask me about my lemon pie," but I didn't. I just wanted coffee and silence. Still, she asked where I was headed, and I told her, to see my daughter. "She's having her first child." Tilda smiled and said, "But she can't wait to see you." I didn't have the energy to correct her. The lie tasted sweeter than the bitter truth sitting at the bottom of my mug. I left her a good tip anyway, like I always did. I'd gotten good at giving. Too good. As the miles disappeared behind me, so did the conviction that I was doing something noble. Somewhere between Iowa City and Rock Island, I stopped rehearsing what I'd say when I arrived. I started bracing for what I wouldn't hear. No warm greeting. No laughter. Just maybe an awkward thank you, if I was lucky. Still, I pressed forward. The road narrowed. The temperature dropped. My hands grew stiff on the wheel, but I didn't stop. I told myself I wasn't chasing belonging. I was delivering love. I lied to myself the whole way there. By the time I reached the outskirts of Larkfield, the sky was soft with evening haze. Christmas lights blinked from every lawn, garlands draped over porches, inflatable Santas battling in the wind. It looked like a holiday card, the kind we used to fake smiles for when Marley was little, back when we were still a family. I slowed as I turned onto Willow Crest Drive, instantly recognizing Cassandra's house from the photos she used to post online. It had changed. New shutters, brick driveway, Lexus in the garage, BMW in the front. Nothing that said, "You helped make this possible," even though I knew the figures by heart. $76, $540 over 4 years. That money had paved the way for more than Marley's med school. It had paved this entire new life they had carefully curated without me. And still, I showed up. Still, I parked my truck 3 houses down so as not to draw attention. Still, I carried the cradle like it was a gift, not a symbol of desperation. As I walked toward the house, I imagined what it might be like to see Marley open the door. Maybe she'd cry. Maybe she'd hug me and whisper, "I didn't know how to ask you to come." Maybe Cassandra would look at the cradle and remember all the years I spent building not just furniture, but futures. I stood on the porch, knuckles hovering over the bell. Then I pressed it. That moment, that single chime, carried more hope than any blueprint I'd ever drafted. I waited. Footsteps. A click of a lock. The door opened, and there she was. Cassandra, dressed in a champagne-colored gown, holding a glass of wine, her lips painted the same shade as her hostility. Her eyes slid over me like I was someone selling solar panels. "Sorry," she said with the faintest hint of amusement. "You've got the wrong house." And then she closed the door. Just like that. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The cradle in my arms felt heavier than ever. The porch light buzzed above me, flickering once before steadying. Inside, the muffled sounds of celebration leaked through the cracks. Laughter, music, silverware clinking on china. A baby shower in full swing. One that had no room for the man who paid for the diapers, the ultrasound bills, the overpriced bassinet she probably never used because she had newer, trendier ones. My fingers curled around the cradle's handles. Not out of anger. Out of instinct. I wanted to protect something. Anything. Even my own broken gesture. But there was no door to knock on again. No second chance being offered. Just the echo of a life I'd helped build, now sealed shut behind wood and brick and pretenses. And me. Still standing there, carrying love no one wanted to receive. I stood there longer than I should have. Long enough for the cold to settle into my coat seams, for the ache in my back to remind me I wasn't 30 anymore, and for the reality to sink in. That door wasn't opening again. I didn't expect fanfare, not a banner across the porch that said, "Thanks, Dad," or a grandchild's name carved in icing on a cake I'd never see. But I thought, no, I hoped there'd be a pause. A flicker of recognition. Something human. Cassandra's eyes didn't flinch when she shut the door in my face. Like I was a delivery man with the wrong address or some washed-up neighbor trying to sell nostalgia. Sorry, wrong house. For words. For dismissive, definitive syllables that slammed harder than any insult she'd ever thrown at me during our divorce. I didn't leave right away. I stepped back off the porch and stared at the window to the left of the door. A shadow moved behind the curtain. 2 figures, maybe 3. Laughter spilled out faintly through the walls, muted like it had passed through layers of insulation and selective memory. The cradle was still in my arms, my gloves clinging to its polished surface. I had spent over 70 hours shaping it. Each curve, each notch, sanded smooth between project deadlines and solo dinners in a quiet Denver apartment. I wasn't trying to buy love. I was trying to earn it back. Or at least remind Marley that I hadn't disappeared. I'd just been positioned where they needed me. Silent, giving, and always a few hundred miles away. The porch light buzzed above me. I looked down at my boots, wet from snow, speckled with salt. The cradle's legs left 4 tiny impressions in the powdery white blanket beneath me as I finally set it down. For a second, it looked like it belonged there. A quiet symbol of care, untouched by the noise inside. I wanted to knock again. I wanted to shout, "She's still my daughter." I wanted someone to explain to me what crime I'd committed that earned me this kind of exile. But I didn't. I didn't beg when Cassandra filed for divorce 10 years ago, and I wouldn't start now. Dignity is all I've ever carried with consistency. I stepped back from the cradle and reached into my coat pocket, fingers brushing past the receipt from the motel I'd booked, the last gas station coffee lid, and the folded printout of Marley's Amazon baby registry that I had studied like a blueprint. I found my phone and opened it, not to call, just to see. I tapped the banking app and stared at the log. There it was, line after line, all time-stamped and labeled. Cassandra Ellison, wire transfer. Marley tuition, paid in full. Nursery renovation. $2,100. I scrolled and scrolled. It didn't look like generosity. It looked like rent for a place in their lives they'd never intended to let me visit. And still, I paid it faithfully. The front door opened again, not fully, just a crack, like maybe someone had reconsidered. For half a breath, I straightened my posture, hoping. But it wasn't Marley. It was a man. Mid-50s, crisp jawline, confident stance. He wore a tailored navy blazer and shoes that cost more than most people's weekly paycheck. He looked down at the cradle with a smirk, then up at me with amusement smeared across his face. "She didn't tell you," he said, voice smooth and casual, like he was chatting with a valet who parked his car crooked. I said nothing. "She said you might try something like this. Showing up." He chuckled and shook his head. "You really thought wiring 70 grand made you family?" I felt something twist inside my chest. He ran his hand along the edge of the cradle, my cradle, with the kind of condescension you reserve for garage sale furniture. "Nice craftsmanship," he said. but I think she's more of a modern stroller type." Then he turned, just like Cassandra had, and disappeared back into the warm hum of the life they had constructed without me. The door clicked shut behind him. I stood frozen, not because of the temperature, though the cold had started to seep through my socks and stiffen my fingers, but because of what had just been said. "You really thought wiring 70 grand made you family?" That line echoed in my head like a cruel refrain. I didn't even know his name until that moment. Cassandra had mentioned she was remarried, but never said much else. Now he had a face, a voice, and a seat at the table I'd helped fund. For a moment, I thought about picking the cradle back up and hurling it off the porch. Let it splinter across the pristine driveway like all the illusions I'd carried. But I didn't. I'm not a man who breaks things, not when I've spent my life building them. So instead, I pulled my coat tighter, turned back toward the sidewalk, and walked the same 200 feet to where my truck sat parked in quiet defeat. The snow had started again, light, feathery flakes landing on my windshield as I climbed into the driver's seat and stared straight ahead. I didn't cry. I don't do that easily. Engineers are trained to separate emotion from logic. But that night, something cracked. Not in a dramatic, sobbing kind of way, but in the quiet, surgical way grief often works. You realize you're not just unwelcome. You're invisible, disposable, and they've made peace with your absence long before you even considered showing up. I sat there in the cab, the engine idling, watching the porch light fade in my rearview mirror as I slowly reversed back down the street. The motel was 15 minutes away, an aging roadside inn with flickering neon signage and a front desk clerk who didn't ask any questions. Room 112. The curtains smelled faintly of mildew, and the heater rattled like it was coughing up decades of dust. I placed the gift box on the corner of the small table, stared at it for a long time, then sat on the edge of the bed and unwrapped it. Each item I pulled out felt like a small betrayal, not of them, but of myself. As if I had foolishly believed that effort equals love, that showing up, bearing gifts, bearing witness, would mean I still mattered. But what I felt in that moment wasn't heartbreak. It was clarity. They weren't cruel. They were simply finished with me. Quietly, cleanly, with a smile and a slammed door. And all I could do now was accept it. I was halfway down the steps when I heard the door creak open again. At first, I thought maybe it was Marley. That she'd seen me from an upstairs window, that something inside her had stirred, had remembered. I turned slowly, heart wedged somewhere between caution and foolish hope. But it wasn't her. It was him, the man from earlier. His silhouette was clean and calculated against the warm glow of the party behind him. He stepped out like the porch belonged to him, which, I guess now, it did. Tall, trim. Maybe a few years younger than me, or maybe he just spent more time in gyms and less in crawl spaces rebuilding cracked foundations like I had for most of my career. His smile wasn't kind. It was the kind of smirk men wear when they already know how the story ends, and they're the one writing the last chapter. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't have to. I recognized the smugness. Victor Lane. I remembered the name from a card Marley had signed once. Love from Marley and Victor. At the time, I assumed it was a friend, a classmate, someone temporary. I didn't realize that was him, the new man Cassandra married, the man who'd replace me in the house I helped pay off during our marriage, the man who now stood between me and the child I raised. He took a slow step forward, shoes polished so perfectly they caught the Christmas lights above. He looked me up and down, and I could feel the measure in his gaze, not just of my clothes or my posture, but of my usefulness. And then he said it. She didn't tell you? His voice was smooth and slick, like oil on black tile. That you weren't invited? Man, that's cold. I didn't answer. What was there to say? He already knew the answer. He was basking in it. I kept my hands clenched at my sides, knuckles stiff from the cold, and from holding on to dignity like it was all I had left. I should have walked away, but I stood still, rooted in disbelief and some quiet ache I couldn't quite name. Victor reached out and casually tapped the cradle with his fingers, a quick double knock like he was testing drywall. "This yours?" he asked. Then, without waiting for confirmation, he added, "Nice work. Real craftsmanship. Old school stuff. Shame no one here needs it." His words hit in waves. I felt each one settle over my skin before it sank in. "You really think 76 grand makes you family?" he said, smirking wider now. "You were the donor, not the dad. Don't confuse the two." I felt the snow building on my shoulders as I stood there, unmoving. The wind curled around the side of the house, catching the hem of my coat, biting through the fabric like spite. I didn't trust my voice not to crack, so I didn't use it. I just stared at him, and in that silence, I saw it all. The power. The control. Victor wasn't just the man behind the door. He was the door now, and Cassandra had handed him the keys. He took a sip from the drink in his hand, something amber and expensive, then turned and walked back toward the entrance. Before stepping inside, he glanced over his shoulder and said, "Next time, try FedEx. Saves you the embarrassment." Then he disappeared into the warmth. The door didn't slam this time. It clicked shut like punctuation at the end of a sentence I wasn't meant to hear. I stood there long enough for the snow to start forming soft ridges along the base of the cradle. My fingers twitched at my sides, itching to grab it, to take it back. Not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted something left, something to hold on to. But I couldn't bring myself to lift it again. Not after that. The cradle was no longer a gift. It was a monument to delusion, to wasted effort, to the one-sided currency of my love. I took a slow breath and let it out through my nose, watching it curl in the air like smoke from a smothered fire. Back at my truck, I climbed in and turned the ignition just to run the heat. I didn't drive off immediately. I just sat there, staring through the windshield at that house. I imagined Marley walking through the rooms, glowing, proud, her hand over the baby she was carrying. I wondered if she thought about me today, if she ever looked at a textbook in her old room and remembered who bought it, if she ever saw a cradle in a window display and thought, Dad would build a better one. I doubted it. If she had, she would have come to the door, or the window, or sent a text, anything. But there was nothing. 10 minutes passed before I could move. My gloves were damp from the snow. My chest felt hollow, like something had been carved out and left behind with the cradle. I didn't have the language for what I felt. Not grief. Not quite. It was something colder, heavier. A realization that no amount of money, no handmade gift, no perfectly timed visit could reclaim what they had already ridden me out of. Victor hadn't slammed the door because he didn't need to. The message had already landed. I pulled out of the neighborhood slowly, watching the lights fade in my mirrors. It was like driving away from a home that never existed. I stopped at the nearest parking lot, a pharmacy closed for the night, and just sat there, staring at the lit screen of my phone. No new messages. No missed calls. No change. I opened my gallery, scrolled back to the last photo of Marley and me. Her 12th birthday. She wore overalls and a paper crown. I had my arm around her, grease on my cheek from fixing the sink that afternoon. We looked happy. I zoomed in on her smile. I'd forgotten how much it looked like mine. And now she lived behind a door guarded by Victor Lane and a silence too thick to break through. That night, I didn't cry. Not in the motel. Not in the truck. But something inside me shifted. Not a collapse. More like a quiet cracking. The first signs of a man finally realizing he couldn't build bridges where people were busy digging moats. The snow kept falling, and I finally stopped waiting for someone to open the door. I didn't drive straight to the motel. Not right away. I needed to put distance between myself and that house. Between me and the cradle. Between the man who smirked like he had inherited something sacred when in truth he had just stepped into a hollowed-out space I used to fill. I turned onto a side road and let the wheels roll aimlessly through Larkfield. The town was dressed for Christmas, wreaths on every lamp post, garlands drooping between storefronts, plastic reindeer frozen mid-gallop on lawns. It was all so pleasant. And yet I felt like an intruder just passing through some illusion. Everyone else seemed to belong to something. I was the only one circling lost like it was a destination. I pulled into an empty park lot near what looked like a closed elementary school. The snow was getting heavier now, thick flakes dropping like ash. I cut the engine, sat in the silence, and pulled out my phone. The cold had made my fingers stiff, but I tapped through the familiar apps like muscle memory. First, my bank. I opened the dashboard and stared at the numbers. My thumb hovered over the transfers tab like it had done so many times before. But this time, I didn't intend to send anything. Instead, I tapped into my payment history. There they were. Every deposit, every receipt, every auto deduction. I'd kept everything. Not because I was preparing for proof, but because it's what I do. I build. I document. I track what I've given, what I've held together, even when the seams go unnoticed. Over 4 years, I'd wired a total of $76,540. Tuition installments while Marley was at med school. A new MacBook when hers crashed before finals. Right when her campus apartment was evacuated during a flood. Cassandra's name was on most of the receipts, of course. She was always the go-between, the polite thief. But there were more. $2,100 for nursery renovations. I remember that one. I'd received an email from Cassandra that said, she's trying to get the room ready. It's a lot all at once. Think you could help a little? A little. Always a little more. $650 for a prenatal course. $320 for miscellaneous maternity expenses. That was the phrase she used. Vague, soft, wrapped in just enough ambiguity that questioning it would feel unkind. And I didn't question it. I wanted to believe I was helping. I needed to believe that love, even at a distance, had value. But now? Now the cradle was sitting on a porch like abandoned furniture. And I had nothing left but numbers and proof that I was the only one who thought any of it still meant something. I scrolled through the transfers again, then slowly began reversing them figuratively, not literally. I made the mental decision to stop. I tapped into each connected account, unlinked every joint payment option I'd kept, just in case. The emergency fund I'd silently maintained? I closed it. Cassandra's name was removed. The auto payments to her phone line? Canceled. The cloud storage I'd upgraded so Marley could keep all her ultrasound scans in high-res? Done. With every deactivation, I felt something loosen in my chest. It wasn't relief. It was release. Like I was finally climbing out of a contract I hadn't known I'd signed. One where my worth was measured in transactions, not presence. I wasn't just pulling financial plugs. I was reclaiming space I didn't realize I was allowed to take back. By the time I reached the motel, the snow had thickened to the point where my headlights felt like flashlights in a blizzard. The parking lot was crusted in slush. I backed into a corner spot and sat there for a moment longer, letting the heater run. My phone buzzed. Once. Then again. Then again. I didn't look at it right away. I knew what it would be. When I finally picked it up, I saw them all lined up, 61 missed calls. Most from Cassandra. 12 messages. The first few were somewhat civil. Graham, what are you doing? Then came the tone change. You're being cruel. Why would you leave that there like a threat? Are you trying to ruin this for her? And then, the final one. Just 5 words. You'll regret this. Trust me. Regret. That word used to scare me. It used to keep me up at night, wondering if I'd said enough, given enough, been enough. But in that moment, sitting in the stale heat of a rundown motel room with an unopened gift box on the nightstand and a head full of memories that didn't seem to belong to anyone but me, I didn't feel regret. I felt clarity. I had driven 900 miles with hope buckled into my passenger seat, and all I got in return was a door slammed in my face and a stranger's laughter in my ears. No. I wouldn't regret pulling the plug on people who only kept me around as long as I stayed quiet and paid up. I didn't respond. I powered the phone off, took off my coat, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my reflection in the dark screen of the TV. I looked tired, not just from the drive, from the years, from the effort, from loving people who didn't love me back, not in any way that felt real or safe or reciprocated. I used to think if I just gave enough, showed up enough, offered enough, they'd remember. They'd forgive. They'd include. But people don't keep you around because you're generous. They keep you around because you're useful. And tonight, for the first time in years, I wasn't. The cradle I built would probably be gone by morning. Someone might take it. Maybe it'd sit on the curb until the snow buried it completely. Maybe Victor would throw it out. Maybe Marley wouldn't even ask where it came from. But I knew what it meant. It meant I had finally put something down. Physically, emotionally, spiritually. And I wouldn't be lifting it again. That night, I slept without checking my phone again. Without calling anyone, without praying for anything to change. And when I closed my eyes, I wasn't carrying them anymore. The next morning, I drove back to Denver in silence. I didn't turn on music, didn't listen to a podcast. I let the road do all the talking, the hum of the tires and the low growl of the engine carrying me across frozen highways and snow-dusted towns. Somewhere past Des Moines, I stopped for gas and stared at my reflection in the station's restroom mirror. My face looked older than I remembered. More lines around my eyes, a hollowed-out kind of tired that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from years of holding out hope like it was a lifeline. I splashed cold water on my face, dried it with a paper towel, and didn't say a word. Not even to myself. Not that day. Back home, I walked into the quiet of my townhouse and locked the door behind me like I was sealing something off. The place smelled like dust and old pine cleaner. I hadn't decorated for Christmas. I usually didn't. My holidays were often just background noise, marked by the absence of plans and the presence of polite text messages that said, "Hope you're doing well," from people who didn't really mean it. I kicked off my boots and hung my coat, then walked straight into my home office. That room was my archive, my memory bank, my ledger. Engineers are meticulous. We don't forget numbers. We don't misplace details. I sat down at my desk and opened the drawer that held my record books. Not just tax files or utility receipts, but everything. Every check stub I ever wrote to Cassandra. Every online transfer printout. Every tuition invoice marked paid by father. Marley's first year of college? $18,000 in room and board. Second year? Another $19,000. I covered gaps in her student loans, co-signed for her car, even paid for the parking ticket she never mentioned until collection notices came to my address. I wasn't a weekend dad. I was a financial institution with a heart. I flipped through folder after folder. There was one labeled Nursery Prep, with receipts from Pottery Barn, Amazon, and a boutique baby store in Chicago. I hadn't seen a single photo of the nursery. Not one. I'd asked once. Got a short response from Cassandra. "We're still finishing it up. I'll send you something soon." That was 6 months ago. Marley never sent a picture either. I didn't push. I'd learned over time that asking too many questions got me labeled controlling. So I let them volunteer what they wanted me to know, which turned out to be very little. But what broke me that day, more than the money, more than the records, was a note tucked inside one of the folders. A drawing. Marley's, from when she was 10. Crayon on printer paper. A little girl with brown curls holding hands with a tall man in a hard hat. "Me and Daddy at the bridge," it read. I had taken her to a job site that summer. Let her walk across the scaffolding. Let her wear my backup vest. She thought I was building the whole thing myself. I remember how her eyes lit up when she told her classmates, "My dad builds cities." I held the drawing for a long time, tracing the stick figure she labeled as me. That version of me was solid, present, admired. Now I was just a ghost who paid on time. That line wasn't one I imagined. Marley said it herself a few years back. It was during a video call while she was in med school. She was stressed, tired. I offered to send her a little extra for groceries, and she laughed and said, "Thanks, Dad. You're like a ghost who always pays on time." At the time, I thought it was a joke. I laughed too. I even smiled about it for a few days. But now, I see it wasn't a joke. It was a definition. I was dependable, invisible, and used to it. I looked around my home. Photos of Marley lined my shelves. Her in graduation robes, her with a stethoscope around her neck, her standing beside Cassandra at a wine bar in Chicago. I wasn't in any of them. I took most of them myself, or paid for the experiences they came from. It was all proof of a life I'd helped build but wasn't allowed to enter. I had funded everything from a distance, thinking that if I was useful enough, they'd make room for me again. But usefulness isn't love. It's a transaction, a service. And once you stop being needed, you become obsolete. I didn't cry. I didn't throw anything. I'm not that kind of man. I just closed the folder and sat back in my chair. Stared out the window. Snow was falling again, soft and slow. It blanketed the streets without asking for permission. Quiet, unbothered. I envied it. How it could fall anywhere and still belong. That night, I poured myself a scotch and stood in the kitchen, staring at the empty cradle in my mind. The one left on the porch. The one that would never be cradled in laughter or gratitude. I imagined Victor tossing it into the garage, maybe breaking it down for firewood. Maybe Marley wouldn't even know where it came from. Or maybe she'd see it and feel nothing. That's the part that stung. Not the rejection, not the absence, but the possibility that my effort had become background noise. Unseen, unimportant. I toasted the air. To the ghost, I muttered. Right on time. And then I made a decision. I'd stop trying to be useful in the lives that treated me like an expired coupon. I would stop paying the toll for a road that never led back to me. I was tired of sending love into a void and calling it family. They didn't need me? Fine. But from this point forward, I'd stop being their silent foundation. Because even bridges collapse when the weight's only on one side. I was making coffee when the voicemail came through. It was Tuesday, mid-morning, and the air outside was brittle with January chill. The kind of quiet that makes the windows feel thinner. I had just finished res-tacking the folders in my office, placing them neatly into a fireproof safe I hadn't used since I kept blueprints for the 44th Street Bridge project. Now it held financial records, photos, and the last decade of proof that I'd been showing up, even when I wasn't seen. My phone buzzed from the counter. A voicemail. No caller ID, just unknown. I ignored it at first. Let it sit while the coffee dripped and the sun filtered through my blinds like thin regrets. It wasn't until the second mug that I opened it. I figured it was a scammer, or maybe someone from the office asking about permits I'd stopped overseeing. But when I pressed play, the breath caught in my throat. It was Cassandra's voice. The recording started mid-conversation, likely a pocket dial. Her tone was casual, amused, coated in that brand of confidence she wore when she thought no one was watching. Let him feel guilty, she said, laughing lightly. Maybe he'll double the amount. He always does eventually. I froze. Her voice was too clear, too close. The kind of clarity that doesn't just confirm suspicion, it tattoos it into your bones. Then another voice. Marley's. My daughter. He sent another book, she said, her words laced with exhaustion, as if I were a chore to be managed. This time, it's on baby brain development. With a note. I didn't even open it. Honestly, I'd rather he just Venmo'd. The silence in my kitchen was suddenly deafening. The hum of the refrigerator felt louder than it should have been. I pressed replay. Not because I didn't hear it the first time, but because some part of me needed to confirm it wasn't a bad dream. The second time through, I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel grief. I felt clarity. A clean slice of it. For years, I told myself the distance between us was circumstantial. That Cassandra had poisoned the well, sure, but that Marley was busy, distracted, that she'd come back around once life settled. Once the baby came. Once she remembered who I was to her. But this voicemail, this ugly little echo that wasn't meant for me, made one thing painfully clear. She hadn't forgotten me. She just didn't want me. I stared at the phone, my thumb hovering over the screen. I could have responded, called back, left my own voicemail. Something dramatic, something poetic. But what would that have done? They weren't on the other side of a misunderstanding. They were on the other side of a decision. And I was the only one who hadn't accepted it. I didn't delete the message. I didn't save it either. I let it sit there like a loose nail on a step I no longer intended to walk on. Later that day, I went into my garage. Not to build, just to think. The wood shavings were still scattered near the bench where I had shaped the cradle's legs. The tools were aligned, untouched. It was the one place in my life where everything stayed where I left it. Where effort turned into something you could actually hold. I ran my hand over the bench, the surface worn smooth from years of use. This was the language I spoke fluently: saws, joints, blueprints. I understood material. It was people who kept shifting underneath me. I picked up a block of maple and stared at it. For a moment, I considered carving again. Something small. A toy. A box. But my hands didn't move. I just stood there, holding it like a weight I hadn't realized I was tired of lifting. That night, I went through the bookshelf in the living room. One by one, I pulled out the books I had once earmarked for Marley's future child. Board books on engineering principles. Pop-up guides to bridges and buildings. Each one marked with sticky notes. Marley loved this page, or good for bedtime stories. I had made a pile of them over the years. I thought they'd be shared. I thought one day, she'd hold her baby and say, "Your grandfather gave us this." Now, I placed them gently in a box marked donate. It wasn't an act of bitterness. It was housekeeping, emotional and otherwise. The next morning, I got an alert on my phone, another payment request, from Cassandra. Through a third-party payment app, $1,200. The subject line said, car seat plus stroller set. No note. No greeting. Just a request, like I was a monthly subscription service that had briefly missed a cycle. I stared at it. Then I declined. Not ignored. Declined. I typed 2 words into the optional response field. No more. I didn't expect a thank you. I didn't expect a reply. But I wanted the message to be seen. Read. A small flag planted in the ground that said, "I'm done being mined." By the end of the week, I'd changed every password on my accounts. Removed Marley and Cassandra as beneficiaries from insurance policies I had quietly kept updated. I didn't do it to be vindictive. I did it because I finally understood. I had been financing a relationship that no longer existed. They weren't asking for love. They were managing resources. And I had been one. I went for a walk through my neighborhood that evening. The snow was falling lightly, and the world looked soft again. I passed the Andersons' house. They'd just put up new string lights, blue and white, and blinking in steady rhythm. Their grandson waved at me from the porch. I waved back. A simple moment, but for the first time in a long while, I felt unburdened. Light, even. That echo of Cassandra's voice, of Marley's dismissiveness, it didn't haunt me anymore. It clarified me. I had spent years confusing guilt with duty, confusing access with acceptance, confusing usefulness with worth. Not anymore. I was still a builder, but I would no longer build where I wasn't wanted. Winter turned to spring without ceremony. One morning the snow just didn't return, and the birds started singing again as if they'd never stopped. Up in Aspen Ridge, the days lengthened without permission, and the trees shed their silence like coats. I fell into a rhythm. Quiet, consistent, clean. I woke early, made coffee, opened the windows. I sanded old scraps of wood in the loft and read manuals I hadn't touched since Marley was in middle school asking me how bridges stayed standing. I wasn't building for anyone anymore, but my hands didn't like being idle. That part of me never changed. It was during one of those late mornings, April maybe, when I noticed Carlos sitting on the bench across the ridge trail. I'd seen him a few times walking slowly with a cane, usually wearing the same brown jacket and flat cap, the kind you don't see much anymore unless the man wearing it has earned the right to move slowly. That day, he nodded at me as I passed. I nodded back. He said, "You walk like someone who used to move faster." I smiled. "I used to have a reason to," I replied. "Don't we all?" he said. It started with casual hellos, then turned into small talk. Eventually, I learned Carlos had worked demolition in Albuquerque for 3 decades. "Funny, huh?" he said once, chuckling. "You built things." I tore him down. Same knees, though. He was a widower, retired for 15 years. No kids. "Never trusted myself to raise him right," he said. I never told him much about Marley, just that I had a daughter once. He never pushed for details, and I never offered them. That made it easier to keep showing up. We started having lunch every Thursday. Sometimes we cooked, sometimes we just shared leftovers. One time I made chili, and he showed up with cornbread and a half-drunk bottle of bourbon. "Bourbon makes the truth easier to chew," he told me. I nodded, but I didn't drink it that day. The truth I was chewing didn't need help going down anymore. It was already lodged deep enough. It was Carlos who introduced me to Imani. We were at the general store picking up nails and duct tape when she walked in carrying a stroller, a squirming toddler balanced on one hip, and a grocery list in her mouth. "You need a third arm," Carlos said, laughing. "You offering to loan me one?" She replied, her tone sharp but warm. "That's Imani. Doesn't waste time with fluff." I stepped aside to let her pass, and she nodded in that tired, grateful way young parents have when someone makes the world a fraction easier. Later that day, she knocked on my door by mistake. Thought my cabin was Carlos's. When I opened it, she blinked, half apologized, half exhaled. "Sorry," she said. "Thought this was your grumpy friend's place." I smiled. "He lives downhill. But you can rest a minute if you want." She hesitated, then nodded. "I might take you up on that." We sat in silence for a bit. Her son, Langston, she said, chewed on a toy dinosaur like it owed him money. Imani told me she'd aged out of the foster system, lived in 5 homes before 18, and worked 2 jobs now to stay ahead of bills that never came slow. "Sometimes I think I'm doing everything backwards," she said. "Like I'm building a house while the roof's on fire." I understood that feeling too well. "The important part is knowing it's your house," I said, "even if you have to rebuild it 12 times. She looked at me like no one had said that to her before. After that, she visited sometimes. Not out of need, just connection. Carlos started calling us the porch people. Imani laughed. "Speak for yourself, old man. I'm barely 30. Still, she brought coffee when she could, and Langston liked climbing the steps to my cabin like it was Everest. He always reached the top and shouted, 'I did it!' And I'd nod solemnly like it was the greatest feat I'd ever witnessed." One afternoon, while Imani was telling a story about a customer who tried to pay for a latte with a scratch-off ticket, I realized my hands were fidgeting with something. A piece of soft pine. I had started carving again, absent-mindedly. Just small, slow passes with a blade. I didn't even know what I was shaping until 2 days later when it started to take form. A cradle, but not the cradle. This one was smaller, rounder, a bit simpler. I didn't draft plans. I just let my hands decide. It took 3 weeks. I worked on it during quiet moments, After coffee, before bed, when the house was filled with the kind of silence that doesn't ache anymore. I finished sanding the last edge on a Tuesday morning. That afternoon, I called Imani. "Can you stop by?" I asked. She sounded distracted. "Sure, everything okay? Just something I'd like you to see." She came later that evening with Langston bouncing on her hip and her hair tucked into a loose scarf. When she stepped into the cabin and saw the cradle, she froze. Her eyes flicked between me and the wood, and then back again. "Is that for me?" she asked quietly. "No," I said. "It's for your child." She covered her mouth with her hand. "Graham, I don't know what to say." "Say thank you," I said. "Or don't. I just wanted him to have something that came from care, not cost." She didn't cry right away. I could tell she was the type who saved her tears for private moments, the kind who'd learned early on that crying in front of people often gave them power. But her hands trembled when she touched the edge of the cradle. "No one's ever done something like this for me," she whispered. "Not just because." "That's not true anymore," I said. She hugged me. It wasn't awkward or overdone. It was firm, warm, grateful. Langston stared at us like he was witnessing a rare animal sighting. When they left, I watched the cradle being carried down the steps and knew I hadn't built it for them. I'd built it for myself, to prove I still could. Weeks passed, and something strange happened. I found myself smiling more, laughing even. Carlos dragged me to a local community meeting once, and I sat through 2 hours of people arguing about recycling schedules and wildlife fencing, but I didn't feel invisible. Imani invited me to Langston's birthday. Just 5 people, some cupcakes, and a lot of noise. I brought a hand-carved puzzle. She called it ridiculously thoughtful. I started teaching Carlos how to use Zoom so he could talk to his niece in Oregon. We argued about button placement like it was a high-stakes design flaw. He never got it right, but I think he liked having something to struggle with again. I never mentioned Marley or Cassandra, not by name, not by story. But one day, while drinking coffee by the porch, Imani looked at me and said, "Sometimes the people who share your blood aren't your people. You find your people later." I didn't respond, but I reached for the arm of the chair she sat in and gave it a gentle tap. That was enough. The more I lived, the more I understood. Family isn't who you give to. It's who gives back, even in small, quiet ways. It's who stays after the noise fades, who sees your empty hands and doesn't ask for more, but gives you something to hold instead. By June, the cabin didn't feel like an escape anymore. It felt like a beginning, and I wasn't building to be remembered. I was building because I could, because someone, somewhere, might need it. It happened on a Thursday. The kind of day that didn't ask to be remembered: gray sky, distant drizzle, air thick with the scent of wet pine and thawing earth. I had just finished restocking the woodpile, hands still raw from the cold, and a nick on my thumb from a careless grip. I was rinsing the blood off in the sink when I heard it, the knock. 3 short raps. Confident, deliberate. Not a neighbor looking for sugar. Not Carlos, who would have called first or shouted from the porch. No, this knock had a familiarity to it. The kind that carries years inside it. The kind you don't forget. I froze at the sink, water still running, my thumb under the stream. Then slowly turned off the tap and reached for a towel. My breath stayed low, steady. I walked to the window, careful not to creak the floorboards too loud, and peered through the side slit where the curtain didn't fully close. And there she was, Cassandra. She stood on my porch like a faded memory trying to come back to life. Same posture. Same curated elegance in her clothes, like she'd dressed to make a point. Her hair was pulled into a sleek twist, and in her hand, she held a manila envelope. She wasn't wearing gloves, even though the wind bit the way it always does up here. She shifted her weight once, then glanced back at her car parked awkwardly by the tree line. A silver sedan I didn't recognize, probably a rental. She didn't knock again. She waited, like she expected the weight of her presence to do the talking. And maybe once upon a time, it would have. There was a period in my life when I would have rushed to open the door, when even the chance at reconciliation, however small, would have been enough to drop everything. But that part of me had gone quiet. Not bitter, just still. I stepped back from the window, and I didn't open the door. Inside, the cabin remained warm. The fire from earlier still glowed in the hearth. The faint smell of cedar and coffee filled the space. I sat in my chair by the window, but stayed out of her sight. My heartbeat didn't race. There was no trembling, no debate in my chest. Just the calm of someone who had already let go. She stayed on the porch for maybe 5 minutes, though it felt longer. Eventually, she crouched slightly and slid the envelope under the door. I watched her straighten, give one last look toward the cabin, then turn and walk back to her car. She didn't glance back, and I didn't watch her drive off. When the sound of her engine disappeared into the trees, I waited, not out of fear, but because the silence afterward was a gift, and I wanted to respect it. When I finally bent down and picked up the envelope, I could already feel what it would contain. I opened it slowly. No dramatics, just the quiet peeling of paper, like turning the last page of a story you already know the ending to. Inside was a note. Handwritten. Neat. Controlled. Marley wants to talk. That was it. No hello. No explanation. No apology. Just a message relayed through the woman who'd orchestrated my absence in the first place. I stared at it for a long while, as if more words would appear if I just waited. But they didn't. Cassandra had always been skilled at brevity when it served her. She knew how to say the most with the least when control was the goal. I didn't crumple it. Didn't burn it. I just laid it on the table and picked up my phone. I could have ignored it. Could have waited. But silence, I learned, could be both a weapon and a boundary. This time, I wanted it to be the latter. I typed one sentence and hit send. Tell her I'm still alive, but not available. That was all. Because I wasn't trying to wound. I wasn't seeking vengeance or silence soaked in spite. I was protecting something I had only recently begun to understand. Peace. The next day, Imani dropped by with Langston. She brought blueberry muffins she'd made from scratch, her hair pulled back in a loose braid and her eyes bright from sleep, a rare thing for a single mom. I didn't mention the knock. I didn't have to. Some things don't need to be spoken aloud to be understood. She watched me carefully that morning, like she was measuring something in me. Eventually, as Langston napped on the floor next to the fire, she said, "You good?" I nodded. "Better than I've been." "You sure?" I looked at her then. Really looked. And I said, "I think I used to believe that love meant staying available. Always. No matter what. Even when it hurt." She waited. Didn't interrupt. Just listened the way good people do. "But now," I continued, "I think love, real love, knows when to let go. When to step back. When the door needs to stay closed." She smiled softly. "That's not walking away, Graham. That's walking toward yourself." That night, I lay in bed and stared at the wooden ceiling beams. The same ones I'd inspected when I first bought the cabin. I counted the knots, the grooves. My father used to tell me every scar in wood was a story, a life mark. I think people are the same, and I had finally stopped sanding mine down to make them palatable for others. I thought about Marley, not the version Cassandra tried to control or the woman who once called me a ghost that pays on time. I thought about the little girl in overalls who once asked me if buildings missed the people who built them. No, I told her then. But the people sometimes miss the buildings. Now I think she was right to ask it that way. Because there's a part of me that will always wonder what version of us we could have salvaged if money hadn't become the language of love. If manipulation hadn't become the currency of our bond. If Cassandra hadn't become the editor of every letter Marley never got to write. But that part of me, it's no longer in charge. I've given what I could. Time, money, forgiveness, hope. I've left gifts on porches and voicemails and inboxes. I've carved cradles with trembling hands and walked through memories like mines. And now? Now I listen to the knock and make a choice. And this time, I chose me. It was Christmas Eve again. A full year had passed since I made that drive to Larkfield, Illinois, the cradle seat belted beside me like it was a child. A full year since the door slammed in my face, since Victor Lane's smirk sliced through the cold like a blade, and Cassandra's voice told me I had the wrong house. And it was 1 year since I decided I'd never beg again to belong somewhere that needed my silence more than my presence. I thought, maybe, the day would sneak by quietly this time, like snow in the night. But grief has a long memory, and so does peace. I woke before dawn. The cabin was still, warm from the fire I'd let smolder overnight. Outside, the trees stood like sentinels, their limbs dusted with white. I sat in the rocker by the window, coffee in hand, and watched the dark melt in delight. In the corner of the room stood the second cradle, the one I made for Imani's son. She brought it back last week. Langston had outgrown it, his legs now dangling off the end like he was trying to escape babyhood with purpose. But she didn't return it out of need. She returned it because, in her words, this deserves to be seen. It sat beneath the window like it belonged there, the soft gray wool lining still intact, the wood polished with care. Not a single dent or scratch. Just quiet reverence. She wants to keep it, Imani had said. Pass it down. Not just because you made it, but because of what it meant when you did. I didn't say much at the time, just nodded. But something in me shifted then. Not pride, not nostalgia. Something simpler. A sense of being seen for what I gave, not just what I could give. Later that morning, I made cinnamon rolls from scratch. Carlos was coming over. Imani too, with Langston and a little bag of mismatched gifts wrapped in newspaper comics. Our version of Christmas didn't include a tree stacked with presents or forced smiles. It was soup on the stove, jazz on the radio, stories passed around like heirlooms. I didn't decorate the cabin in anything except intention. Around noon, we sat at the table, and Carlos launched into one of his demolition tales. Something about a failed casino implosion in Vegas and a wall that refused to fall. Like my third ex-wife, he added, grinning. Imani rolled her eyes and tossed a dinner roll at him. Langston clapped like it was a magic trick. I laughed, really laughed, and realized I hadn't done that on Christmas Eve in years. After the meal, I stepped out onto the porch while they cleaned up. The cold air hit my face like memory, sharp and honest. I pulled my coat tighter and stared out across the ridge, the valley stretching below like an untouched canvas. That's when I felt it, the absence. Not the painful kind. The clear kind. The kind that arrives after you've finally swept out the clutter that people left behind. Marley wasn't here. Cassandra wasn't here. Their ghosts no longer haunted the corners of my life. I still loved my daughter. I probably always would. But I no longer clung to the version of her I once knew. I no longer mourned who I thought she might become. The cost of clarity isn't light. It's heavy, like walking away from a house you helped build brick by brick, knowing someone else moved in and changed the locks. But the payoff is this: peace. Real, unbothered, untraded peace. The kind that doesn't require you to shrink yourself just to keep your seat at a table. Back inside, Carlos was falling asleep in the chair near the fire, arms crossed, hat tipped over his eyes. Imani was humming softly while Langston played with his new toy truck near the cradle. She looked up at me and smiled. "You okay?" she asked. "Better than okay," I said. "I think I'm free." That night, after they left, I lit a candle and placed it by the window. Not for tradition, not for show. Just as a way to mark the space I had carved out in the world, not with blueprints or money, but with boundary and grace. I poured myself a glass of scotch and sat on the porch, wrapped in a wool blanket, letting the night settle around me like a friend who no longer asked questions. I thought about that first cradle again, the one left on the porch in Larkfield. I don't know what happened to it. Maybe they tossed it. Maybe they sold it. Maybe it's rotting in a garage somewhere beneath plastic tubs of party decor and winter coats. But I no longer felt the pull to wonder, because I finally understood, love isn't what you build for others. It's what you protect within yourself. I used to measure my worth by what I gave. Every wire transfer, every gift, every compromise. But all that did was teach the wrong people that I was a resource, that I could be accessed, tapped, drained. I spent so many years being useful I forgot what it felt like to just be, to be wanted for who I was, not for what I covered, fixed, or funded. Now, I keep my circle small and intentional. Carlos, who still calls me Bridge Boy and argues about the merits of cornbread texture. Imani, who makes coffee like it's a ritual and whose strength never comes at the cost of her kindness. Langston, who calls me Mr. Graham and believes I can fix anything, even broken wheels and wobbly chairs. And myself, finally included in my own life. The world doesn't prepare men like me for this kind of quiet. We're taught to build, to provide, to absorb. But no one teaches us how to step back, how to stop over-functioning in relationships that run on guilt, how to say, "I've given enough," and mean it without shame. I used to think that forgiveness meant letting people back in. Now I know it can also mean letting them go and wishing them well from a distance they've earned. Cassandra chose a version of me she could silence. Marley followed. And maybe one day she'll come knocking. Maybe not. But the man I am now doesn't live by that door anymore. I placed the glass down beside the rocker and leaned back, letting my head rest against the worn wood. The stars above were sharp and clear, no city lights to dilute them. A year ago, I stood on a porch holding a cradle and a heart full of desperate hope. Tonight, I sat with both hands empty and felt more full than I ever had. Clarity came at a cost, but it gave me back myself. Not as a provider, not as a background character, but as a man, whole, still standing. And finally, home.